I would agree with pretty much everything Martin says there. Always some good information. Definitely the heaviest Aerosmith album, and certainly the heaviest song as well, which is probably why I liked it so much. But we're going to get into it a little bit more now. We're going to bring in the man who created the show. This show is his idea. He worked with Dennis Miller for many years on a variety of things, including his podcast. He does a variety of podcasts of his own, which I was just on one recently. I got Kiss, which was fun. But we're going to talk about Aerosmith. Mr. Christian Bladt, how are you, sir?
Thank you so much, Brian, for turning this much of a spotlight over to me. It's always fun to just sit off to the side backstage and listen to you talk to other people, because I think the show works because you're a fan. Whoever you're talking to is a fan. Everybody listening to, we're all just such big fans of this music and these songs. So just getting to jump in and be a part of the fray is going to be a lot of fun, I think.
Absolutely, and you know what you're doing here, so I feel confident you'll be completely fine. Of course.
Well, I'm the one who edits the show, so no matter what, I'm going to sound great.
Exactly. So yeah, Aerosmith. I asked you which artist you wanted to talk about. So I always like to get the guest vibe, and we mentioned a few, and we hadn't talked about Aerosmith yet, which I was like, I don't think we have, which is kind of criminal because they're a very important band to hard rock and heavy metal, of course, and this record being. I remember when it first came out in '76 because I had heard Toys in the Attic first. Again, thanks to this amazing radio station we had in Los Angeles, K West. And so I obviously became a fan, went back to the other records, and then this one came out, and I was already a fan. But I was just blown away by, again, this is 1976, which was 75 and 76 to me were two of the greatest years of music in the heavy world ever. But this came out in 1976 and just blew me away by how really heavy it was. Like, again, when you talk about 1976 and what was going up against, this album was really heavy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can point to Zeppelin, obviously Sabbath and things like that, but even compared to earlier Aerosmith albums, this is so heavy. And, for me, and I think for a lot of Aerosmith fans, when you're going to talk about the band, you always need to start off with, well, which is their better album, Toys in the Attic or Rocks? Now, somebody can make a case for another album, but I'm probably not going to take them as seriously if they're going to make a case for literally any of the other two. And, depending on the day, you can convince me one or the other. I always lean towards this one, but somebody really, goes song by song. I'm like, yeah, Toys in the Attic is also amazing, but I love the heaviness of this album. And obviously the album starts with Back in the Saddle. And then the second song is Last Child. And then you have Rats in the Cellar. Any one of those songs would be an amazing start for the album. You drop the needle, you hear any one of those songs, and it's amazing. So it's literally like a barrage. Like the first three songs, they're punching you in the face. And, Last Child fools you a little bit. It starts out real slow. But also I am going to pat myself on the back for a moment, because when I was suggesting songs to you, 3 songs that I suggested were all the ones that Martin said were the heaviest Aerosmith songs. This one, Nobody's Fault in Combination. So if I'm thinking like Martin Popoff, he of 150 books, I must be on the right wavelength.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And I agree with you. I mean, I can go back and forth on Rocks or Toys in the Attic, but over the years, and they're both amazing, both incredible, amazing records. But over the years, I really lean towards Rocks. I think it was, kind of, I don't want to say it was the greatest time for Aerosmith, because they obviously released a lot of incredible music after this. But I think for this version of Aerosmith and kind of where they were before they got, huge, big, and famous. Although this record did ship platinum, by the way. So they were already pretty big and famous back in the day. But I'd always go back to this record. I still can listen to it now. And that's what we talked a lot about on the podcast, about what's records that stand the test of time. And, a lot of stuff you go back and listen to, just you loved back in the day, but it doesn't hit you the same way as it does now. But this is one of those records where, I can listen to it. I listened to the whole thing a couple days ago, and it's like, this record is still incredible.
Yeah, it's also, especially a lot of albums from this era are not particularly long. So if you're putting something on the album, you're most likely going to stick around and hear the
Yeah.
whole thing. I can't imagine hearing Back in the Saddle and not whatever it is 34 minutes later hearing Home Tonight. I can't imagine not doing it that way. And what I love about this song in particular, though, obviously it's really heavy, but from the Alice Cooper catalog, you did Halo of Flies, and this song is like half the runtime of that. So it does the same thing, though. It's almost like you took an entire rock concert and you packed it into 4 minutes, because there's some very unusual solos. Like Martin pointed it out before. I just wasn't even thinking about it. The first solo is a harmonica solo, and you're
Yeah.
like, oh, that's a choice, especially for 1976. But as you always talk about on the show, that the blues is really the root for so much music, including metal. And I mean, Aerosmith always, like, the sort of the quintessential blues rock band, them and the Stones, really. So the harmonica does not detract in any way. He plays it so furiously, and I love the speed of which everything happens in this song. It's almost like they've got, it's almost like it's 10:56 and curfew's 11, so they have to plow through this song, otherwise they're gonna have the plug pulled on them. And I've listened to it so many times in the last 24 hours that I can't get enough of just how intense it is and the way it builds like that.
Yeah, and of course, and if you listen to or you talk to any of the, we'll say the big four, really any of those bands from the thrash metal scene or speed metal scene, I mean, this was an early precursor to that. This was a very fast, heavy song for 1976, and all of those bands were all massive fans of Aerosmith, and specifically this record. I would say, like you mentioned, we go back and forth between Toys in the Attic and Rocks, and as you said, you can have an argument for either one, but this one seems to be of the heavier bands, always everybody's favorite Aerosmith record. And if I wear, like, I'll wear an Aerosmith rock shirt to go to, a Slayer show or something, and so many people are like, "Oh, great album, great album, great album." So the fans know, and certainly the bands know, and that's kind of why a lot of. It's funny. I was talking to a future guest a couple days ago, and I was saying, so who's in a huge rock band. I don't want to let him out yet because I want to get it done first. I don't want to jinx it.
Sure.
But actually, he's in two really big rock bands. But he's a huge metalhead too, which I know. I said, so I want you to come on the podcast. Like, who's your favorite metal band? And he mentioned the band, which is a newer, real heavy band. I said, okay, cool, that's great. We haven't done them yet, and they definitely should be on the list. And he's just kind of asking a little bit about the show, and I was saying, yeah, I'm doing Aerosmith Rocks tomorrow, and we're doing Rats in the Cellar. He's like, oh, you go back that far? I go, yeah, this is the origins of heavy metal. I mean, this is where it all began. These were the songs that inspired all the metal artists. And there's always this big argument. We've talked a lot about this on this podcast, where, well, this is all rock or hard rock, and none of these bands want to be called heavy metal, but they were heavy metal. And Martin mentions it. And even if you look at the Wikipedia about this record, it mentions heavy metal as well. So yeah, that's why it's important to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, and I would think that it's almost like Toys in the Attic and Rocks are like a fork in the road. So if you love Toys in the Attic, like, I would bet that Chris Robinson from the Black Crowes, I've never heard him say this, but I would bet his favorite Aerosmith album is Toys in the Attic. But like the guys in Anthrax would say Rocks, because that's going to lead me down a very different path. But obviously they're both great, and there's no wrong answers between those two. And and the jamming in this, for a song that's only 4 minutes, the fact that they're playing it so quickly, I think, is why it works. I'll have to admit to dabbling. Like, I saw the Grateful Dead a couple of times, and I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard these songs, but what are they doing for like 20 minutes? Like, I don't like long meandering jams. I like a really good guitar solo. It doesn't even have to be short. It just has to be good. And it just seems like, obviously this is a studio recording, so it makes perfect sense, but there's no wasted time, and some of those bands, I wonder what they think when they put out, 20-minute songs.
Yeah, 20 minutes is a little too. As I've mentioned many times on here, I love big, long, epic songs. But yeah, 20 minutes is a bit much, unless it's like an album like Fate's Warning doing A Pleasant Shade of Gray or something. Then it's okay. But
Yeah, or like Jethro Tull's "Thick as a Brick." It's like, well,
yep, exactly.
we've got one song. I mean,
Yeah.
one song on the album. You know.
But it's a variety of different things. But you brought something up that kind of is interesting too. Is that this song also there's so many parts to it. It's very progressive sounding in the fact that it's they go from one part to a different part to a different part. It's not just a regularly structured song, and it has kind of odes and nodes of the progressive stuff, which we all have seen and heard from now. And I know all of those bands as well all look very fondly upon this record.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt it for a second. And the interesting thing is that when it comes to Aerosmith, I find them mostly in the late '80s. I grew up listening to classic rock radio. I'll shout out WPDH in Poughkeepsie. They never gave me a job, but I'll mention them because they had like such a better mix. Where I lived, we had WNEW out in New York City, but it was like even at that point in the late '80s, it was like they almost had like a top 40 playlist of classic rock, and then I felt like I knew the entire Aerosmith's greatest hits by the time I was out of middle school, and I didn't know any deep cuts, but I knew all the greatest hits because I would hear them. So they really grabbed my attention with MTV and Permanent Vacation, specifically Ragdoll more than Dude Looks Like a Lady. Dude Looks Like a Lady. I was like, all right, it's a little catchy, but I loved Ragdoll, and just you're like, God, these guys are so cool. I mean, you've got Steven driving down, I think, Bourbon Street, and literally every door there's a woman running out waving to him because he obviously made his way down the block, and I'm like, man, this is the coolest guy I think I've ever seen. And so I love Permanent Vacation and Pump. Kind of stops right there because for me, Get a Grip, like half of it's good and half of it is the Alicia Silverstone songs. But I still think that they were great. And I will talk to a lot of people specifically. We've done podcasts with Mark Cicchini from the Three Sides of the Coin Kiss podcast, and he can't believe that anybody likes late 80s Aerosmith. But I'll say those two albums, they're still great. I mean, well, I guess they're not even still great. They're great again because there was a little bit of a lull in between. And it's very well polished. It's very Desmond Child, but songs like Hangman's Jury and their cover of I'm Down by the Beatles, they're still great at that point. And that's when I really got caught up in that band. I mean, Pump came out like September. I was in 8th grade, and they had Love in an Elevator. The video had been everywhere that summer. So I was ready for that. That was like, I'm getting this when it comes out. And I still think that's a great album, Pump.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. I like those two records a lot also. And the remnants or spirit, or however you want to talk about 70s Aerosmith, is in those records too. There's some heavy tracks, especially on Pump, probably more than the other one, but there's still some heavy stuff there. And every once in a while they would write an amazing song that I forget which album it's on now. It might be Permanent Vacation, but it's like what is it? Some Trails of India or whatever. But it's an amazing song. So every once in a while they'll pull something out. It's like, wow, that's really cool and really heavy. But what's funny that you mentioned, talking about Rats in the Cellar and jam band stuff. So when Aerosmith did their residency here in Vegas, I saw them 7 times and they were phenomenal all the times. First 5 the best because they were pretty much only playing 70s stuff, which was awesome. And then I guess somebody guilted them to doing more 80s stuff later on. And they didn't play Rats in the Cellar often. They changed the set list almost at least every couple of nights, which is great. That made me want to go back because you never know what you're going to see. And I only got to see Rats in the Cellar once, but it was spectacular. But it was a jam. They probably was like an 8 or 9 minute version of Rats in the Cellar. It was this incredible jam in the middle of it, which is incredible, which is really, really great. So it's kind of funny you mentioned jam and we're talking about Rats in the Cellar. I also can't not mention Combination and some of the other songs on here. They're really heavy. My other favorite song on this record is Sick as a Dog, which I think is just, the riffs on that song are so great. And they do This is what I bands do this, and I love it because it just makes it so much heavier when you slow something down in the middle of a song and then you hit back really hard. And that song is one of the best versions of that, which slows down to just the one guitar, da-da, da-da, and they kind of build it up and then bah, smash your head in. So good.
Yeah, we're talking about jam so much. It's funny because obviously I get Pump, and I'd already when I was discovering a band, obviously I had to go out, and at this point I was buying a cassette of everything. So when I had $9 more, I would like go and buy the next one, but I would always get them in order. I was like, all right, I'm gonna get the first Aerosmith, and then I worked my way up. So around the time that I finally got Rocks, I also had this VHS that came out, which was Aerosmith Live at the Texas Jam 1978. And the first song on that is Rats in the Cellar. And it's like such a great, crazy opening. And, just watching that, I hadn't seen them live just yet. And just watching them, and in that era, I'm like, oh my God, again, this is like the coolest band that I've ever seen. And the fact that that videotape started with that song, I certainly remembered hearing it when I listened to the album, but it's like you really start to appreciate it when you see it. I'm using air quotes live, even though
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
watching a video cassette,
Yeah. Well, the funny thing too about Aerosmith, the 70s, I don't think I saw them at all in the 70s, maybe one time. They didn't do a lot of touring because of their addiction issues and everything else. And they were
Well,
also,
I've heard about times where they would go out on tour, but then not play most of the shows because
yeah.
they couldn't get on stage. Yeah.
Yeah, and they were always, a lot of my friends who went to see them in the 70s were like they were very inconsistent, and a lot of times they weren't very good. That Texas Jam show was pretty good, but I also defend them sometimes because maybe I just got the right nights. But I'm a big bootleg collector, and I have a lot of 70s Aerosmith bootlegs, which are like radio broadcasts, or there's a couple of board tapes, but they're actually really good. And the radio broadcasts and board tapes, like you can't fix those. They're live and right there. And they were actually really good. So I always thought that they were pretty good live, but I've heard even the band talks about it in their books about how inconsistent they were, let's say, in the 70s.
Yeah, you had to catch them on the right night. And yeah, I mean, I understand that that's kind of how live bootleg comes about, the actual official release,
Mhm.
because there were these board tapes out there that sounded so good. They're like, all right, well, we'll pick and choose stuff from that. And, that I guess that live album, maybe it feels a little disjointed because it's from all these different shows. And then there's some radio broadcast. And I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think Come Together and Chip Away the Stone are like, tech rehearsal or something. And they don't really feel live. But I think that that's an underrated live album, just because when you get past the fact that it's disjointed like that, your buddy Eddie Trunk always talks about how you can hear the M80s going off, people throwing them up in the air, so it's like a
Oh,
very 70s, it's a great feel. And what I love about that Texas Jam video from the first time that I saw it, Steven's voice cracks a couple of times, nothing he should be embarrassed about, but there's feedback, and it's that 70s thing where you get the lens flare because you zoom in and somebody moves out of the way and you're zoomed in on one of the stage lights. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is very sloppy, but like in the best way possible,
yeah. The only thing I get complained about all those 70s concert footage movies were just everything was so up close. There weren't a lot of cameras in the back, and I guess it was partially a lighting issue, but that was just kind of way people were doing it back then. But it's like I want to see the whole thing. I don't need a close up of everybody's face and hands. Like, let me see the actual stage. But then sometimes you do see the stage and it's not lit properly for a video, so it's just kind of really dark. Like,
Yeah.
that's the way it is with like Alice Cooper's Billion Dollar Babies tour video that's out there. You can hardly see anything on the stage. It's so dark.
Yeah, I mean, and now there'd be a drone from like 2 miles away from
Well,
the
yeah.
stadium, and then fly over, and all of that. And that Texas Jam, by the way, that video, that's the first time that I ever saw the talk box being used. I'd heard
Oh,
Frampton Comes Alive, but I'd never seen it. I didn't quite understand how that song came from. And during Sweet Emotion, there's Joe with that thing in his mouth, and I'm like, that's how they do. I'm like 13 at this point, so I don't think I had ever really thought about it. But yeah, it's very cool. And over the course of like that, basically from that year that Pump came out, between that release of Pump and the time I saw them, I've shared this on other shows. Only our video audience will see it, but I have this
Oh, nice.
amazing 3-day period in 1990 where at the local county fairgrounds in Orange County, New York. So I saw Kiss on the 17th. Note the $15 ticket, and saw Aerosmith on the 19th, the $20 ticket. But that's Aerosmith with the Black Crowes opening, and the Black Crowes' first record. They hadn't quite found themselves, but it was such a great show. Those are the second and third concerts I ever went to, Brian. So
That's a good weekend.
Yeah,
it's a very good weekend.
The first one was like 3 months earlier. I saw Alice Cooper on the Trash Tour. So basically, from concert 4 onward, I was like, oh wait, they're not always these like huge bombastic stage shows.
Right.
But yeah, and I did enough homework that I was able to be excited because I actually looked up the set list from that Aerosmith show. They did Last Child, When the Lightning Strikes, and a little bit of Darkness from Done with Mirrors.
Cool.
So yeah, and so even then they were still mixing it up, and I can't imagine putting that set list together. You're talking about the residency, but when they were doing regular tours, it's like, all right, somebody's going to want to hear, the asteroid song. Don't want to miss a thing, and I guess you feel like you have to play one of the Alicia Silverstone songs, but if I saw them 3 nights in a row, you could tell me which one I saw each night. I'm like, okay, I couldn't tell. I thought that was Crying, but I guess it was Crazy or Amazing.
Yeah, but that was the great thing about the early residency stuff is they would play a couple of those songs, but a lot of it was the early stuff. And one of my other favorite Aerosmith songs is "Seasons of Wither," and they had a whole incredible production set up for that because they basically played it every night. That was just phenomenal. But one thing I want to mention too that Martin brought up, which is always really interesting and it kind of makes sense, is about why this record is so heavy is because they were going, and dark is because they were going through a dark period. And I can relate to that because Black Sabbath Sabotage, which is my favorite Sabbath record, as we've talked about on the show, they were at a very dark period. And that's why that record is so heavy. So I can see where I never really thought about that. And even when reading the books, you get a piece of that, but you don't get all of it. And the way Martin always very succinctly describes stuff is like, oh, that makes sense. That a lot of bad stuff's going on, a very dark period of time for them. So it makes sense the record would be dark and heavy. So
yeah, I mean, and
he's made it great.
He's specifically getting into the fact that they were doing this downtown in New York City. And, I was kind of, going into New York City on the cusp. I remember the Giuliani, AKA Disney World, New York City, the Times Square that got cleaned up. But I also remember from before that. And I can't imagine what it was like in that era. And it really captures that sort of feeling, that just maybe the danger, I guess, of being there. And that was an interesting thing. Martin said that, I guess, Steven's drug dealer had gotten killed right before that. So it makes it that much darker.
Oh yeah. And I started going to New York probably around 83, I think was the first time I went there. And I first 3 times I stayed with a buddy of mine at his parents' house, a little upstate, but I started to stay in Times Square. Every time I went there, starting about the mid 80s. And yeah, it was interesting back then. The famous hotel, there's the Hotel Iroquois, which is right in smack in Times Square. And Times Square at that point was horrible. It was terrible. 42nd Street you don't walk down there at all, especially when it gets dark. But we stayed at this Hotel Iroquois because it was like the rock and roll hotel. Everything there was super cool. The rooms were insanely cheap, but still nice. And they would just let us all party and do the whole thing. So it was quite a time. And so that was 9 or 10 years after this. So I can only imagine what it was like then, because I heard it was much worse then than it was by the time I was starting to go there.
Oh yeah, but I mean, even still in the early 90s when I started going into concerts, I would where I lived, I would take the bus, so I would come into Port Authority. So that's right on 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. So you had to walk through all that stuff, and it was like, oh my god. But there were so many great venues. Roseland was like 10 blocks away, but it was a bit of an adventure to walk those 10 blocks.
Yeah, I had definitely a few evenings of walking around New York City in the evening by myself, where you're kind of like, am I going to be okay here? So I always try to wear a really big biker leather jacket, just so I looked somewhat intimidating, I suppose. But yeah, but I think that and again, as we talk about all these songs on here, it's just interesting how the environment of the band, especially the environment where they're recording, you talk about, like Rainbow, going to these old churches and castles in England to record. It's like dark and damp, and they need that environment to kind of make the art. And I could definitely see how grungy New York City in the mid 70s was probably a really good place to create art, which it did, because it's put out this incredible record that we're still talking about all these years later.
Yeah, Rocks wouldn't be Rocks if they had whatever that studio was in the Bahamas or whatever.
Yeah.
I think I don't think
never know.
That's true, but I'm assuming that it wouldn't quite be like this. But yeah, it's all a time and place, I think, and yeah, that's why it really is, the best, or at least one of the best Aerosmith albums, and certainly one of the best albums of the '70s for sure.
1,000%. I agree. Well, dude, thanks so much for doing this. It was a lot of fun bringing it out from behind the scenes. So everybody gets to see that yeah, he's a real legit fan, just like we all are. It's all good. It's all good. So yeah, thanks for doing this. And I'm sure we'll see each other again sometime soon.
Yeah, and I'll let everybody know that my personal podcast, the Blattcast, BLADTCAST, Brian's been on a couple times. This year had the 50th anniversary of Alice Cooper's Welcome to My Nightmare. We did Kiss Alive. I think you weren't available for Toys in the Attic, but it's you, it's Don Jameson, and we've gotten Martin on. It's almost like doing this show, except on my channel. So yeah, I'll spell it one last time, BLADTCAST, and thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, of course. And definitely check out the podcast. It's a good stuff. And if you like what you're listening to here, you can carry it over there as well.
Thank you. Let me pause it.
Once again, we welcome in producer extraordinaire. You've heard many times on this podcast, and listen, this is our first episode, then you'll meet him for the first time. But our good friend, Mr. Jay Ruston, how are you, sir?
I'm good, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and of course, when we're doing Aerosmith Rats in the Cellar and Rocks, had to bring you in because of your connection with the man who produced this record.
Jack Douglas. Yeah, I mean, it's a loose connection, but it's a connection nonetheless.
Well, you're still all Canadian, so there's that.
Yeah, well, Jack's from New York, but he got in with Bob Ezrin in the early 70s as his engineer. If you look at some of the early Alice Cooper records, Jack is the engineer, along with the great Jay Messina, who engineered this record as well. And Ezrin, of course, worked for Jack Richardson, who was my mentor and professor in recording school, Garth Richardson's father. And so they were all kind of tied together, and they had a company called Nimbus 9 in the 70s and made all kinds of hit records. But Jack was heavily encouraged by Bob Ezrin to also be a producer. And of course, he went on to work with, John and Yoko and all kinds of amazing bands like Cheap Trick and whatnot. But again, there's always a secret weapon on a lot of these records that we talk about. And this one obviously has a really cool story. And I'm sure a lot of people have talked to you about this, but the fact that they basically tracked it in their rehearsal warehouse for the most part, and brought in a PA system and tried to make a big, loud, and ugly rock record. But again, the secret weapon here is engineer Jay Messina, who engineered Kiss Destroyer, some Alice Cooper stuff, and of course worked with Jack on Cheap Trick. So Jack being an incredible engineer, also having Jay Messina there was, I'm not surprised they pulled off what they did with a remote truck in a warehouse in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and I know Martin was mentioning too that some of it was recorded in New York City, which New York City in 1976 was quite an experience. And Martin mentioned that it's their darkest, heaviest record because they were all going through a lot of drug issues and a lot of other stuff going on. So it makes sense that the record would be dark and heavy because of that. And yeah, I think for them, from what I remember, the story part of it is that they were so messed up, it was just easier for them to be able to do it at the rehearsal room. Because I think if they're in New York City, according to Martin, Steven Tyler's drug dealer got killed like during the recording of this record. So yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah, they did work at the record plant on this record, and the previous album, Toys in the Attic, I think was done completely at the record plant in New York.
Mhm.
So Jack getting together and showing up with what they had as in ideas, and a lot of the band members contributed to the songwriting in this album, which was kind of new. But Jack was very good about getting them to just show up and work on that material. And they realized after a few weeks that the space and the vibe, they were not going to be able to recreate it if they just loaded up a truck and headed off to New York. So, you know, they had the foresight to have a mobile truck there probably to document the demo process, and it turned into a real recording. And it's so funny to hear that they had a PA system set up to blast them like a rehearsal or like a show, because that was done quite a bit in the late 80s and early 90s. I know Bob Rock did that with Motley Crue and other bands, but to have that PA system just blasting, I think probably gave them the energy they needed. And the playing on this song in particular, if you listen to the guitar part, it's sort of chugging, but it's like rhythmic and syncopated. It's really tight. And to be assumingly on heroin and drinking and whatever they were doing and play this well is impressive, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, look, you have so many artists back in the 70s and late 60s who were doing all these drugs and were making incredible music and playing incredibly. I mean, you look at somebody like Hendrix, obviously, or Tommy Bolin, you know, a lot of these guys who were doing a lot of heroin, even, you know, Slash, when, you know, they were making Appetite, you know, all those guys. I mean, I think they're a little bit better during the daytime than at nighttime, but they're all in the throes of that and still making this incredible music, which is, I've never done that. I don't know what it's like, but apparently it works sometimes for musicians. I don't know.
Well, I've, you know, in reading up about this record in particular, Tom Hamilton basically said it was such a short window of building up their drug use and then the bad come down after this record where everything started to crack a little bit. But he said there was that one magic moment where the drugs were actually helpful and just like made them open up their creativity and play really intensely and just be like wildly focused on it. And so, but he said that didn't last too long, a couple of years at best. And then it was sort of downhill from there.
Yeah, it never does, right? This song in particular is super, super heavy. And especially for back then, I mean, I you know, you talk to any of the speed thrash metal bands, they all cite this record as their favorite Aerosmith record. And certainly this song was a massive influence to them. And it really was kind of a precursor to a lot of this stuff, and super heavy, there's even some progressive parts to it that are really interesting. And the structure of the song, I remember when I first heard the record, I was like, wow, this is really, because I'd gotten into Toys in the Attic. But listening to this, it was just a little heavier, a little darker, especially this song. I always like, you know, longer songs. It's only 4 minutes or something, so it's not super long. But for Aerosmith in the 70s, it was, though. Yeah, for Aerosmith in the 70s, it was fairly long. But there's all those different, you know, parts of the song too that are kind of progressive, which I always found really interesting. And, you know, when you listen to it now, it still sounds great.
It sounds amazing, and the whole guitar work in the outro is incredible. And I was reading somewhere that, you know, Steven never really had lyrics. He always just had melodies and he would sort of scat. But if you notice in this song, there's a part in it that's very similar to the song Toys in the Attic, where he follows the guitar riff with the melody very much like Ozzy would do. And I've often wondered, like, are they taking that Sabbath thing where Ozzy would often just sing the riff, you know, rather than come up with a different vocal melody? And it happens at a couple spots in this song where he's singing with the riff, and it works really well.
Yeah, and he's such an interesting lyric writer, because there's really, like you said, it's just, there's not really any story or structure. Just kind of, if you read his book, that's the way his book is. Just kind of these random things that he goes in and I mean, you know, he's got terrible ADHD and all these sort of things, learning disabilities, whatever. So it would just, it would be kind of just all these phrases put together, but it all works. That's the crazy thing is, you don't really know what he's talking about. I mean, some of it, obviously, there's some stuff, and Martin mentioned that this song specifically was partially about the drug dealers killed in New York as well. But it's just really interesting how it all works together. But I was listening to it the other day and reading on the lyrics and just I mean, it's brilliant, but it's just kind of just different phrases that don't really make any sense, but they work together.
Well, I think part of the reason that happened is because he had the melody and the rhythm of the lyrics, and he was living with Jack Douglas essentially at the time. And Jack would just have to basically wake him up every day, feed him coffee, and say, okay, what do you want to say? And another story I heard years ago about this song was that it's sort of a sister song to the song Toys in the Attic, Rats in the Cellar, Toys in the Attic.
Yep.
I thought that was really interesting way of putting it too. So I haven't analyzed the lyrics of the two to see how similar, what if the story connects, but I thought that was pretty interesting. But it just, for me, it's, again, when we talked on another podcast about Ron Nevison, to me, Jack Douglas is also that guy where he produced so many hit records. And, other than Bob Ezrin and Mutt Lange and a few others, he just doesn't have like the name recognition outside of our rock and roll circle. And a lot of musicians, of course, know who he is. But, the general public would probably not be too familiar with him.
No,
so
definitely
I think that he needs accolades, because between the 4 Aerosmith records, 2 or 3 Cheap Trick records, and then of course his work with John Lennon, and through the 80s, so many other artists, it's just, the guy's resume is incredible. And he clearly knew, like Bob Ezrin, and maybe that was Bob's influence on him, he knew what a great song required, and he knew how to get it out of these musicians. And I had heard that that's what basically got him ejected from Aerosmith the first time, was they didn't like what he had to say about one of the songs, I think on the record they did in like 1978, 2 albums after this. So that's when they kind of parted ways briefly. And he did come back, of course, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there was, and the band was a mess at that point too. And I'm sure, they had their own theories on things. But I do love like the production of this record too. And again, I harken back to the production of the 70s so much, but the guitar tone is so thick and heavy, and really, Toys in the Attic was similar, but this was a little heavier for me. I just felt it was a little darker, heavier. Maybe it was because they were recording it in basically the rehearsal room, so maybe that made it heavier, maybe more of a live sounding record, obviously because of that. So I'm not sure, but it just was a thicker, heavier record, especially the guitar tones. But it works it in with, with the whole record. It's a pretty dark, heavy record, and the tones work so well with that. And maybe that's part of what they were writing was, they had a darker, heavier guitar tone, so it just made sense the songs were to be heavier. I don't know.
Right.
Speculation.
And I think at one point, Jack Douglas, when he went and met with the label and played them the record, he kind of scared them. They were like, this is really distorted and rocking and scary sounding, basically. And it took them like playing it for a few people before everyone went, okay, we're good. Like this, especially the song Back in the Saddle, being a huge hit for them. But
and Last Child too.
Say again.
And Last Child as well. So.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's a beautiful song. So, I think that you're right. Probably the aggression of being in that room. They were very smart to trust their instincts and not pick up and move. And I know they did knock out a couple songs at Record Plant towards the end, but I don't think any of the important songs. I think the best 6 were all done together. And written together, played together, and he wanted it to feel like a live band. It's a live record, and I'm sure there's overdubs here and there, but Jay Messina, the engineer, a lot of people don't know, he was involved in like Frampton Comes Alive. I think I mentioned Kiss Destroyer. There was another record he did that I made note of that I thought you'd be interested in, and it was Hanoi Rocks.
Oh yeah, he also did
involved with that.
Brilliant band, by the way. He also was involved in one of my favorite super underground 70s band that nobody really knows, but Rex Smith, who went on to be, Mr. Heartthrob guy, he had 2 records by a band called Rex that were very Aerosmithy, very heavy stuff that came out in the 70s. And James Messina, I know he engineered it. He might have produced those records too, but I remember he definitely engineered those, and it had a very similar sound to these mid-70s Aerosmith records, because it all came out around maybe a year or 2 later. But 2 really good people put out 2 records. I think they're finally up on Spotify now. But anyway, I digress.
Interesting. Not familiar with those, and I know Jay was involved with Toys in the Attic as well. I think the same team, right? Him and Jack.
Yeah.
So I mean, and just killer. I mean, Sweet Emotion defines production in a way. I think they did things on that, especially with bass tone and everything, that most of these bands and these producers were inventing things, which doesn't really happen as much anymore. And part of that is a part of that problem is a plugin becomes really popular. Everybody gets it. Everybody uses it. And it's like now, oh yeah. And even back in the 80s when all the keyboards came out, that was also kind of a problem. You'd have like a Phil Collins song and a Tears for Fears song with the same synth sound, It was kind of avoidable.
I always love listening to these records in headphones too, because there's all these little production tweaks in there, and there's a lot of different panning issues. And I remember when I was producing all these records in the early 80s, I was stealing all these things. When we were doing Slayer, we did a lot of different panning stuff because Priest was doing a lot of that stuff back then, and that was Carrie's favorite band of all time, still is. And we kind of took some of those panning things and panning something hard to the right or left of the vocals or something, and just doing different stuff like that we kind of stole from the 70s. So that's why it's always interesting to listen in headphones, because you'll also hear some like noise and some other things. The AC/DC records were the best for that. Like you listen in headphones to those, and there's like guitars where voice start in, and I love stuff like that.
Yeah, me too. And back then it was a lot harder to pull stuff off like that. You had to have all hands on deck on the console. All right, you're going to handle the panning, I'm going to handle the toms, so on and so forth. Vocal throws, like getting a big reverb just on one line. That was all very challenging,
Oh, I know. We were all, every time we mixed the record, it was like everybody that we get like, okay, here's your thing, here's your thing, here's your thing. But
totally. So and people are like, why did it take a year or 4 months to make a record back then? I'm like, well, I'll tell you why.
There you go. I think Christian mentioned too also that, all these 70s records are like, 30, 33, 34, 35 minutes long, which is the beauty of vinyl, because that's all you can fit on a piece of vinyl that sounds good. If you put anything longer than that, it's not going to sound any good because of the technology part of it. So, but I always like that. That's why these bands put out 2 records a year a lot of times, because, they had enough music. But now you can make a record for 74 minutes, which I think is too long in my opinion.
I don't think you should. I'm encouraging all my bands 10 songs max. Let's keep it under 45 minutes.
Yep, that's why we preach the same thing. It's like just 10 songs, maybe 11, but let's keep it. Let's keep it there. So, all right, man. Well, as always, thanks for doing this. Appreciate you, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon.
My pleasure, Brian. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks, man.